Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important webinar on the Israel and Iran conflict, implications for the United States, the GCC, and the Arab world. My name is Delano Roosevelt. I am the president and CEO of the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations, a nonprofit educational organization in Washington, D.C. In recent weeks, unprecedented Israeli and Iranian attacks have derailed Oman facilitated nuclear talks and reshaped regional strategic priorities. The Trump administration faces a critical choice between supporting Israeli strikes or curbing escalation, while GCC countries navigate a delicate balance between strengthening U.S. ties and engaging with Iran. Meanwhile, Arab countries like Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Algeria face both challenges and opportunities in shaping de-escalation efforts. To help us make sense of these fast-moving developments and offer insight into their implications for regional stability, U.S. policy, and multilateral diplomacy, we are honored to welcome a panel of distinguished experts and practitioners, each bringing decades of experience in diplomacy, journalism, defense, and regional affairs. First off, I'd like to introduce Ambassador James Jeffrey, one of the United States' most seasoned diplomats and strategic thinkers in the Middle East. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Ambassador to Turkey, and Deputy National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. And he was a special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy to Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffries currently serves as chair of the Middle East Program and Slatter Family Distinguished Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where he continues to shape policy on security, diplomacy, and American engagement in the region. Next, we'll have His Excellency. We welcome Sheikh Nawaf bin Mubarak Al Thani, a former senior defense official and defense attaché for the state of Qatar. We welcome him to the United States, Canada, and Mexico, where he previously served. As a former brigadier general in the Qatari Armed Forces, Sheikh Nawaf has extensive experience in defense cooperation, military diplomacy, and U.S. Gulf security relations. He played a key role in managing Qatar's defense engagement with U.S. Central Command and NATO partners and remains an influential voice on Gulf defense strategy and regional military dynamics. Next is our very own Dr. William Lawrence, a senior academic and research fellow in residence and director of the North Africa Area Studies Program at and for the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome our dear friend, Mr. Charles Glass, a veteran journalist, broadcaster, and author with over 4 decades of experience covering the Middle East. As former chief Middle East correspondent for ABC News, Mr. Glass has reported from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Iran, often from the front lines. He is the author of acclaimed books such as Tribes with Flags and Syria Burning, which provide both personal and historical perspectives on the region's complex conflicts. He continues to contribute to major international publications and has been an advocate for deeper journalistic and historical understanding of Arab societies. Moderating this discussion is Dr. Fadi Helani, a senior academic and research fellow with the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. With a background in linguistics and Near Eastern studies, Dr. Helani has served as professor at Aleppo University in Syria, Montclair University in New Jersey, and he draws on years of experience across Syria, Jordan, and the UK, including the US. Dr. Helani provides analysis on the strategic calculations shaping the Arab world and its ties to the United States. My dear friend, Dr. Helani, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Del, for this very generous introduction. And I would like to join you in welcoming our distinguished guests. And just to recap on your very good introduction, as for our audience know, in the past weeks, the Middle East has witnessed an alarming escalation between Israel and Iran, triggered by the unprecedented direct attacks, strikes targeting each other's population and infrastructure. These developments have not only shattered the Oman facilitated nuclear and peace negotiations between Washington and Tehran, but have also forced a recalibration of strategic priorities across the region. The Trump administration now faces the dilemma of whether to deepen U.S. support for Israeli led strikes on Iran's nuclear program or to contain the escalation before it triggers a wider war. Meanwhile, Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC countries, must reassess their balancing acts between strengthening security ties with the US and maintaining channels with Tehran. Across the broader Arab world, countries such as Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Algeria face a mix of domestic vulnerabilities and diplomatic openings that may shape their role in any de escalation efforts. And with this in mind, let me jump right away to some questions to our very distinguished experts. And if I start with you, Ambassador Jeffrey, as Israel intensifies its strikes against Tehran nuclear facilities, the Trump administration is being pulled into the escalation. In your opinion, how should the U.S. recalibrate its posture now that back channel diplomacy has failed? And in your opinion, can strategic ambiguity still serve Washington's interest, or does this moment demand a firmer policy commitment?
Thank you, Dr. Helani. Thank you, Mr. Roosevelt. Thank you, National Council, for having me on today. I think the United States is well positioned at this point. I'll get to strategic ambiguity in a moment. Tactically, it makes sense. Strategically, it doesn't, but we don't have a strategic policy of ambiguity. Rather, our policy is very clear. Iran shall never obtain a nuclear weapon or a capacity to develop nuclear weapons, and that includes, per the Trump administration, and this is a difference from prior administrations, no enrichment program. So that is the policy, that is the right policy. It reflects the realities of this region over the past 25 years. What we and all of you who follow the region have seen is, bit by bit, Iran has established a regional, almost hegemonic position through proxies in Gaza, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq. An extraordinary arsenal of long-range missiles, and most importantly, very clear evidence, and I was in charge of managing that portfolio in the White House some years ago. The evidence is absolutely convincing of a nuclear program. Iran was able to do this because the far more powerful alliance arrayed against it, the United States, Israel, the Arab states, Turkey, the Europeans, were diverted into other issues, from fighting al-Qaeda to the Arab Spring to pivoting to Asia, and we neglected to take the hard decisions. Well, the hard decisions came due when Hamas attacked Israel in October of 2023. Since then, Iran and its proxies entered the war against essentially the United States and Israel, with various other actors, Arab states, and Turkey playing various roles at various times on various specific campaigns. The result of this has been a huge defeat of Iran across the region. Its proxies have been largely defeated or have gone silent. Its vaunted missile arsenal against Israel has been largely fired off or destroyed in the last few weeks, with almost no damage to Israel. And much of its nuclear arsenal, but not all of it, and much of its military is now in ruins as the Israeli campaign goes on. So this is a victory as dramatic as the Yom Kippur War or the defeat of Iraq in Kuwait in 1991. So the question is, what should the United States do? We have to exploit this moment to get Iran to either agree to end enrichment or take out its enrichment capabilities. What the Trump administration is doing is, for the moment, allowing Israel to continue its campaign and saying that we likely will engage to take out the most difficult element of that enrichment, which is the Fodro site near Qum, that the Israelis will have difficulties taking out. We will do that, but we would prefer not to. Rather, we want Iran to come and negotiate. So that's the offer that's on the table. President Trump put down a very generous offer that would even allow some enrichment over a period of time as a token to the Iranians. Several months ago, the Iranians rejected it. We'll see if they accept it now. If they do not, President Trump, frankly, will be in a very difficult position. He will have no choice but to use military force. And there, the issue will be enough to take out the Fodro site without provoking a large-scale exchange of aerial warfare and naval warfare between the U.S. and Iran. That's the decision facing Trump today. I think he should continue putting pressure on Iran. If Iran continues to refuse to compromise on something as vital as this, then we'll have to use military force. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. So let me take this point to you, Sheikh Nawaf. Ambassador Jeffrey just described the rationale behind the U.S. engagement in this conflict. But let me ask you, from a Gulf perspective, particularly Qatar's, how is Operation Rising Lion perceived among the GCC leadership circles? And in your opinion, has the erosion of Iran proxy network in the region and, of course, the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria created a space for a realignment in Gulf defense strategy, or has it simply intensified regional anxieties?
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Roosevelt and the National Council for convening this panel. First of all, I think that the GCC as a whole have been very clear in their condemnation of this, in their words, unprovoked attack on Iran. And an attack that happened just a couple of days before the next round of negotiations between the United States and Iran was supposed to happen in Oman, which just derailed that. Most GCC countries, well, all GCC countries have been very clear on that, but they've also been clear in the past that a non-nuclear Gulf, no nuclear weapons on Iran should be the end state. The only issue is how do we get there? The Gulf countries, Qatar, you mentioned, being from Qatar, I can speak for them at least. But I think all Gulf countries have made it very clear that negotiations, a peaceful de-escalatory resolution should be the end state, or the means to get to that end state of non-nuclear. But the moving target, the continuous moving target by the Israelis of, well, it's enrichment, it's a bomb, it's decapitation of military leadership, it's regime change, only to come back 24 hours after that and say, well, it's not really regime change. That moving target removes the issue of strategic ambiguity and just leaves ambiguity without any strategy. And that is quite dangerous because if achieving a political goal through kinetic means is the illusion that the Israelis may have, then the fear with the GCC is that the US government may follow that delusion down a road that we've seen where it leads to. Forever wars, unending conflict, and instability and volatility that will affect regional security vis-a-vis the nuclear facilities that are on the Gulf, like Bushehr, for instance, global economy, that would be clearly affected by that disruption. But it would not achieve the goal. Is it ending enrichment? Well, if you end enrichment, the Iranian government still has enriched material. Well, how do you get to that? And if the question is, well, through negotiation, well, do the whole thing through negotiation. If negotiation is an abandoned, it has been abandoned, then that will not achieve what the end state of Iran not achieving or having a nuclear weapon. This circular discussion of brute force will achieve everything, has not achieved anything in the many decades of the West, trying to do that in the Middle East. I would be surprised if this will be the outlier with such a big target with Iran. I mean, we look at Afghanistan, and I spoke about this a few days ago. After 9/11 and the horrific attack by Al-Qaeda, the issue was, well, the Taliban ragtag group in pickup trucks, they'll be easy to eliminate. Well, 20 years later, trillions of dollars, many lives lost, thousands of lives lost later, those same ragtag group and those same pickup trucks just drove into Kabul and took it back. And it was eventually resolved through negotiations, which Qatar hosts. So why wait to that chapter? Let's get to that point instead of going through the whole machinations of a war that will leave the goals unreached and death and destruction and the economic effect achievable, almost guaranteed. So I don't see how kinetic effort could reach to a peaceful resolution. It hasn't worked in the past. Saying this time again, it's really confusing to many, I think, in the GCC, and that's why the GCC as a whole, the 6 Arab countries and beyond, but if we're talking about the Gulf countries at least, have been uniformly for the end of this military operation and going to negotiation, because really, other than that, it'll be just a continuation of a delusion that force and kinetic activity will achieve the goals that Israel has stated and which is shared by all countries. And if we're being, technical about it, even the Iranians said they don't want military, nuclear weapons. But if no one trusts the Iranians, then verify. The last 2 points I will leave is quite worrying when the IAEA says there's no actual evidence that enrichment, while it's over the actual, and which is very worrying, has led to an active, ongoing development of a bomb. And the reporting by the New York Times just a couple of days ago, citing sources in the US intelligence community saying basically the same thing. There is no active program. The rush towards this level of warfare is worrying for many in the Gulf. If there is enough time for negotiation, why not just go through that and exhaust it? But to start, for the Israelis to start an attack in the middle of active negotiations, the negotiations was not over, neither by the Iranians or by the US government, but it was ended by that activity. That is the most worrying part, and the ramifications, as we see right now, unfortunately in the news, is very worrying, I think, for everyone in the Gulf.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nawaf. And let me pick on your point regarding what you refer to as Israel's allusions to security in the region. And I would like to take this point to Dr. William Lawrence, and thinking about these concerns and the broader Arab world. And as we know, Iran's influence in the region has been significantly reduced after October 7, especially also with the demise of the Assad regime in Syria, which has, to many critics, of course, reduced also the influence of Iran in the Levant, particularly. So, with that in mind, Israel's continued strikes in Syria at certain points and now on Iran. What does this say about Israel's long term threat perception and doctrine, in your opinion? And more broadly, how does this recalibrated balance of power influence U.S. diplomacy across the broader Arab world, particularly also Egypt and, in general, North Africa? You are muted.
So a lot of questions in there, and I'll do my best to address them. But also thank you, Del. Thank you, fellow panelists. This is a wonderful opportunity today to discuss things. The first thing I would say is that picking up on the very first point you made, Iran's influence is waning in the region. There's some interesting sort of inroads in Tunisia and some other sort of blips here and there and around Africa, but there is not Iran is not on the ascendance right now in the Arab world, sort of west of the Gulf. And with the Gulf, you've had this sort of détente rapprochement that's been going on, but I think it's, it's not much more than it looks like at face value. And it's part of this overall desire for stability. The main dynamic in the other Arab countries is this balancing act between efforts at normalization. Of course, 6 countries have made peace with Israel, and populations that are not entirely behind that. In Morocco, for example, the population is very happy with Israeli tourism and some other things like that. But as a general rule, the protests have been quite large, will grow again if this continues. And there's the governments have to play this balancing act between unpopular Israel, not very popular Iran, and how to get back towards the equilibrium that Mr. Nawaf was talking about, which is what everybody wants. I think one of the big questions right now is, are we entering a new phase? Is Israel's attack on Gaza followed by its attack on Iran so brutal that it will unravel normalization, that it will, further deepen, that side of the divide? And that remains to be seen. I think a lot of sort of both antipathy and desire to get closer to Israel is sort of baked into things. And I don't think what's unfolding will drastically change that. But I do see, popularity of the United States and Israel are at all-time lows in the Arab world, if you look at polling. And we will continue to see that stay at sort of greater levels, as long as these multiple conflicts, what some analysts call the 7-front war that Israel's engaged in, as long as that continues. And, as far as I'm concerned, and getting back again to some of the other speakers, the sooner this is over, the better. And I even think that's what Trump thinks, if I could conclude on that point. I mean, Trump wants quick wins. And I think one of the reasons he delayed the decision by up to 2 weeks was that he was, and all the sort of leaked reporting tells us, he was trying to figure out whether the bunker busters would do the job he hopes they'll do and sort of be over with this so he could turn the page and go back to some sort of negotiations in the relatively near future, along the lines of what Ambassador Jeffrey was talking about. And these are untested weapons that haven't been used in battle before. So I think that Trump has a lot of questions on his mind, strategically, geostrategically, militarily, and otherwise. And it remains to be seen. And of course, Trump's decision, more than anything else, will determine where the Arab opinion goes. Oh, one more quick point. Algeria has this major role at the United Nations on the Security Council. It's been interesting to compare, for example, how Algeria has been operating versus how UAE's been operating. UAE bent over backwards negotiating some of the Gaza resolutions to get consensus and at least a U.S. abstention, whereas Algeria has been much more willing to sort of go through with resolutions that back the U.S. into a corner a little bit. So it'd be interesting to see going forward if that's the dynamic that will remain at the Security Council, or whether we'll get more consensus building at the Security Council towards solutions.
Thank you very much, Bill. And if I stick a little bit more in the Arab world because this conflict definitely affects this region, especially when we think about like countries like Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. And Mr. Glass, you have chronicled conflict zones from the ground through your long experience. So, how do you see this Israeli military escalation impacting societies already reeling from years of instability, especially Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, where Iranian linked groups remain, although weakened, as we mentioned? So, could this operation reignite dormant militias or usher a new kind of asymmetric warfare, in your opinion?
I don't know that it would usher in a new type of asymmetric warfare. There's already an old type. And if Israeli troops, for example, remain in South Lebanon, where they've taken the hilltops along the border, eventually they will be attacked. But of course, the Lebanese would like to avoid that, and the Lebanese government has urged Hezbollah not to do anything against Israel, to invite more bombing north of the Litani River. Most of the Arab world is opposed to the Israeli colonization of the West Bank and the depopulation of Gaza. Israel is fighting a war really to continue the colonization of the West Bank and to conquer Gaza and turn it over to Israeli settlers, which is what most of their cabinet ministers have been saying all along. The only people who stood against this were Hezbollah, who were, as a result, more or less destroyed, and Iran, which is also now being destroyed. And I fear for the region when it is on its knees, because it won't stay on its knees forever. People will come back and want some justice. They will want some fairness in relations between Israel and the rest of the region. And for Israel to dominate it violently, as it is doing at the moment, will not be acceptable to masses of people. Look at Syria now. Okay, Iran's position in Syria with the departure of Bashar al-Assad and the rise of Ahmad Shara as Hayat Tahrir Hashem has shown that even when the new Syrian government has offered Israel the hand of peace, Israel bombs it. It doesn't want the new Syrian army to have any power at all. And it's rejected every attempt by Shara to negotiate a new arrangement. And he's offered full peace with Israel, but they've said no. And the Iranians do not want full peace with Israel. The Iranians remain hostile to Israel. It's part of their jihadist ideology. It's very important to the ethos of their regime. They won't give it up, but they will negotiate a major reduction in the percentage of uranium enrichment. They've already agreed to go down almost to 3%, which is what the U.S. was demanding. But they are, unfortunately, from their point of view, negotiating with the gun at their head. And on one hand, they're hearing that if they don't agree to terms, there'll be continued bombing. The bombing is continuing anyway, but the bombing will be intensified. And then if it goes a step further to regime change, what does that mean to change the regime? How are they going to do that? By bombing? By bombing? No. Or you have to put boots on the ground. You have to send troops in to occupy it the way they occupied Iraq. And we saw what happened then. And also, without a regime in Tehran that is replaced by a regime that is acceptable to most of the Iranian people, Iran could go into civil war. I mean, there are separatist movements among Kurds, among Azeris, among Arabs in Khuzestan, who would be armed by various regional powers and maybe even by global powers to fight. And then Iran would become a battleground for a civil war like Afghanistan or like Iraq was in the early years of the American occupation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glass. Very insightful, of course. And I would like to still focus, of course, very much on Iran's part and the U.S. engagement. So if I go back to your earlier point, Ambassador Jeffrey, about U.S. strategic calculations, many observers fear the current U.S. posture may be drawing it deeper into Middle East security entanglements with the Trump administration's firm support for Israel. Do you foresee U.S. expanding its military or intelligence commitments in the region, or is Washington aiming to leverage Israel's actions to reduce its own direct footprint while containing Iran indirectly?
Washington is committed to working with all of the countries in the region for a stable region. There are three threats to security in the region. One that is largely supine now is the offshoots of Al-Qaeda, including the Islamic State. That needs to be watched, but other than in parts of Syria, it's no longer a major threat. The second, which has been by far the biggest threat throughout the region for the last, as I said, 30 years, is Iran. That is what the United States is focused on now. The United States is working very closely with not just Israel, but with Turkey, with Gulf states, with Jordan, on how to move forward. Publicly, there are disagreements. Behind the scenes, everybody hopes that Iran and its proxy network will be dealt a permanent defeat. Because I'm sorry, Iran and its movement through the region is not an answer to the third security problem, which is a very specific one, although one of great concern, which is between Israel and the Palestinians. Iran's march through the region is to expand Iranian hegemony. The Iranian army marched all the way to Marathon on the coast of Greece some 500 years BC, long before there was an Israeli-Palestinian dispute. This is an inherent hardwired issue in the Middle East, which is Iranian expansionist aggression. The United States recognizes that. That is what behind closed doors every leader in the region is telling us. Therefore, the United States is going to work to reduce Iran's long-range threat to the region. Much of that work has already been done, but the last remaining piece at this point is the nuclear portfolio. Whether we get a negotiated outcome or the United States will have to use military force, or Israel might be able to use military force on the Fordo site, the end game, at least for the moment, is well in view. Israel is not going to do regime change, regardless of what they say. The United States is not going to do regime change. We're going to be stuck with this revolutionary Iranian regime. It's just going to be devoid of most of its weapons. We'll see how it responds then. There may be a place for the recent Gulf outreach to Iran to try to work out new arrangements. But the point is, a weakness faced with Iran is what has led to almost 1 million Arabs dying in Yemen, in Syria alone, and 15 million driven from their homes. That's extraordinary.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jeffrey. And let me take this point about the conversation about military force. And here I would like to ask Sheikh Nawaf, as someone who has worked to bridge Gulf and US security frameworks, how do you assess the balancing act now before Gulf capitals? Should the GCC states double down on their US defense partnerships or accelerate a hedging strategy toward de-escalation with Iran? And in your opinion, what mechanisms could help prevent individual Gulf states from being dragged into an Israeli-Iranian proxy war?
Well, I think, all the Gulf states value the vital relationship they've had for decades with the United States. And that is something that no Gulf state, I think, will do without for decades to come. That is just the reality of the world we live in. I think there are countries like, for instance, Oman, that are probably further than the conflict, especially when vis-a-vis the nuclear reactor of Bushehr, than Qatar or Kuwait or Bahrain, for instance, or even the big, economic hub of Bahrain in Saudi Arabia, the Eastern Province. But still, all 6 GCC countries, I think, value that relationship and want to continue to build. But there is also a reality that is setting here in the Gulf, that you can't bomb your way to peace. And I get the idea, and this is a notion that's been been repeated a lot, and the ambassador, I thank him for bringing it up, which is, Gulf states in private would say something that, well, in actuality, the Gulf states are just, screaming and yelling from on top of the rafters. We're against this. We're against this. Now, maybe the behind the doors discussion knows the minds of the people in the Gulf more than we do. That is a possibility, very weak one, but maybe it is a possibility. But let's take the Gulf countries at their word when they say they don't want this conflict to continue. They want Israel to stop this war. Because while the ambassador, I think, rightfully structured the historical threats that maybe the Gulf countries face, if the Israelis, and they've already, probably there are rumors that they've struck parts of Bushehr nuclear facility in Iran. But if a direct hit happens there, and the head of the IAEA just today warned about potential contamination of the Gulf, then Israel's action would be the greatest threat, actual, not pretend, not academic, not historic, but actual to the lives and livelihoods of the people of the Gulf. And that's why the countries of the Gulf on a daily basis have been very clear. Now, we can ignore what they're saying and try to come up with the idea of what they really mean. But I would argue against that and warn against that. Listen to what the GCC countries are saying. They do not want this to be a prolonged conflict. And dealing with Fordo, for instance. Now, the U.S. could hit Fordo. That may happen. It may achieve a tactical, success, but tactical successes, kinetic successes on the battlefield do not even achieve the end of the war from a broader scale, let alone lead to more negotiations. And I'm not sure how that could be verified on the ground. You would need boots on the ground to verify. You would need to secure those material after striking it. It is a confusing position for many in the Gulf to see this galloping towards war with Iran without the expansion towards more negotiation. That's why I think what the president yesterday announced was extremely welcome and brings back that idea of the Gulf, strong relationship with the United States. Welcome when the president said, let's give it up to 2 weeks. Now that the up to is a bit up in the air. Is it 2 weeks? Is it 2 days? But giving negotiations time, I think, it has been welcomed. Unfortunately, even if the U.S. steps away or just strikes Fordo, many in the Gulf haven't seen any answer to the question, well, what would stop the Israelis from hitting other targets, economic targets in the Gulf that will affect Gulf countries, nuclear targets in the Gulf that will affect, Gulf countries. That has nothing to do with the U.S., but we haven't seen an answer from the U.S. or others that would convince the Israelis that if the U.S. says this far, no further, that the Israelis would follow suit. It seemed to be the other way around right now, with the Israelis leading, unfortunately, and galloping towards more destruction. They have, unfortunately, the advantage that we don't have, which is more distance. Even Tehran is further than Bushehr than most of the Gulf capitals. I'm closer to that reactor than the people of Tehran right now. So that is an actual concern and not a theoretical one.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nawaf. And let me borrow your metaphor about the Gulf states yelling at this war. And I want to take this point to Dr. William Lawrence. This Gulf response, Dr. Lawrence, possibly echoed throughout the Arab world, from Egypt, Jordan, to Algeria and Iraq, in a way. What kind of diplomatic space exists for the US, or in a way the EU, to reassert influence in regional peace-building efforts in light of this? And in your opinion, can Washington still position itself as a mediator, or has its alignment with Israel in Operation Rising Lion irreparably damaged its perception among Arab societies and population?
There's a lot of all of the above there. I mean, the damage is done and it's bad, but the entire Arab world, like the whole world, understands that the US is the only country that Israel listens to in any substantial way. And so the whole Arab world accepts, as does the whole world, the US is the only country that can mediate a way out of this. Let me also echo one of the other points that His Excellency raised, which is the contamination risk, which the Egyptian press and a lot of the other Arab press is full of. And the idea of bombing nuclear facilities, particularly after the arrangements that were made in the Russia-Ukraine war to avoid bombing of nuclear facilities, and also the environmental catastrophes, is something that's mobilizing Arab publics to be really unhappy. And also, let me say that depending on whose figures you look at, whether hundreds of Iranians were killed or just 200, and the injuries of 1,200 or 2,500 Iranians, the level of civilian death and injuries in Iran is starting to look to Arabs like Gaza, and to the degree to which they conflate in their minds, what's going on with the Palestinians and what's going on with the Iranians, that could actually tip the scales away from the double antipathy we have right now in the Arab world towards both Iran and Israel, and tip it in favor of Iran. I mean, I remember secular friends of mine in Arab countries saying they went out in 1979 and cheered on Iran before they really knew what was coming, out of a solidarity thing. And so solidarity with Iran will come back if Israel continues to kill and injure a lot of Iranian civilians. Let me also just mention something that you didn't mention, but it's really important. The Israeli freezing of gas exports to Egypt has stopped fertilizer production in Egypt, which is a big deal. As Israel said, we're going to save our oil and gas for strategic reasons, and we're not going to export as much to Jordan and almost nothing to Egypt. So back to your original question, there is a huge upside for the United States in tandem with Europe to play a diplomatic role here and a negotiating role, something that everybody wants to happen, and Trump sort of took one step in that direction yesterday, and whether he continues down that road or goes the other way remains to be seen. I was convinced 2 days ago that 75% Trump was going, and now this is starting to look to me like Obama in 2013, where his own generals are surprised when he didn't hit Syria, and I wouldn't say that there's a closeness between Obama's psychology and Trump's psychology, but this lack of predictability of the United States and this indecision is also something people don't like. I mean, the degree to which we can have some consistency in U.S. positions, some definite collective objectives sort of laid out for the whole world, including that basket of things that His Excellency was talking about in terms of the ultimate goal for the region, including ridding Iran of nuclear weapons, I think is really the way to go here. And if I could add one more thing, a famous former diplomat used to tell me that the U.S., if you don't understand their role in the world, they're the fat lady, that sings at the end of the opera, and everybody waits for the United States, even when they're unpopular, even when everyone's mad at the United States, to make a call and to show decisive moral and strategic leadership. And I think this is a moment where the U.S. could show it or not.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence. And I would like to stick a little more with the impact of this conflict on Arab societies and population, in line with what you said, of course. But I would like to ask Mr. Glass, with his experience on the ground, of course, covering conflicts like this one, in your opinion, how is this conflict now more conventional than being proxy-based as it was, reshaping the regional public opinion towards the U.S., Israel, and even to their own governments? In your opinion, are the Arab populations now more fatigued by conflict or more mobilized as nationalist rhetoric increases with this conflict?
Well, first of all, we should look at the Iranian public, who until very recently were in large numbers, in large percentage, opposed to this regime of theocracy. People were fed up and they were angry. Now I speak to secular Iranians who say they have no choice but to rally around their leadership. Now, I'm an American. I don't happen to like this administration. Okay, I didn't vote for it. I don't support it. But if we were attacked by a foreign power, I would have no choice but to support my state, my country. And that's how the Iranians feel. And many Arabs also feel that. They remember the fact that Iran, far from what Ambassador Jeffrey says, was attacked by Iraq in 1980 with the approval of the United States government and then the further support of the Reagan administration during the Iran-Iraq war for an 8-year war that killed 1 million people. Now that has not gone away from the memory of the Iraqis or the Iranians or most of the Middle East, even though it may go into the memory hole in America. It hasn't gone in the regional memory hole. And to do this again in Iran, making the Iranian regime more popular, which it wasn't until recently, is not healthy for the Iranians, and to draw America into a war, and it's being seen to be drawn into a war by Israeli actions. That Israel is calling it to them. For 20 years, Benjamin Netanyahu has been calling for attacks on Iran, for the making it impossible for Iran to develop any kind of nuclear capacity to allow Israel itself to have a nuclear weapon monopoly in the region. Okay, fine. But does that mean the US has to go along with every single thing that the Israelis want, even if it's not in American interests? And the Arab populations see that America is acting against its own interests in going along with Israel, killing Iranians, destroying the Iranian economy, making life impossible for Iranians, and then maybe bringing a war to the ground in Iraq. And that would be disastrous for everyone. And I think Sheikh Nawaf would know how disastrous it will be for his country and countries around him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glass. I have a question to Ambassador Jeffrey, but before that, I would like him to follow up on this. Yes, please.
Thanks. I started by saying, gee, how did Iran develop this regional powerhouse over the last 20 years when most of the countries in the region and beyond, far more powerful than Iran, didn't want it to happen, yet it happened. Now, first and foremost, many mistakes America made, beginning with going into Iraq. Mistakes Israel made, mistakes Turkey made, mistakes the Arab states made, including the Emiratis and the Saudis when they were about to take Hodeidah in 2018 in Yemen. They listened to the United States and stopped their offense. But my point is, specifically to Mr. Glass's comments, look, I think we've got the Iran-Iraq war a little bit wrong here. Let me go back and recite the reality, the truth here. The United States did not lift a finger to stop the Islamic Revolution from overthrowing an American ally, the Shah, in 1979. In return, what we got was an act of brutal war against us, the seizure of our embassy and taking hostage of some 60 Americans. In the confusion, Saddam Hussein decided on his own, without permission or support from anyone, to invade Iraq. The United States, despite the state of a war we were effectively in with Iran, did not support Iraq. I want to underline that, did not support Iraq in that phase when Iraq went into Iran. What happened was, very quickly, within about a year and a half, the Iranians repelled the Iraqi aggression. At that point, and now we're talking about where we got the 1 million casualties, at that point, Iran launched its counter-invasion into Iraq with a very good chance of seizing the entire south of the country and most of its oil reserves. At that point, the Arab world, the United States and other countries grew alarmed. We were not friends of Saddam Hussein, as we saw later, but we certainly didn't want to see Iran take over much of Iraq. That is, we then supported Iraq at that point. But I was involved in those operations, and I can assure you that we were very careful not to help Iraq in any way continue or carry out new attacks on Iran. The assistance, which was very limited, that we gave them, the Gulf states gave them many billions of dollars. We gave them mainly intelligence information on Iranian dispositions inside Iraq. We didn't want Iraq to fall under Iran. That was a very smart position. It was supported by every single state that we work with in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey, for this following up. And I wonder if Mr. Glass would like to follow up with a quick comment on this. Um, yes, please.
The Carter administration did approve the invasion, and what's more, when the Iranians went into the Fao Peninsula, the U.S. approved the use of chemical weapons on the Iranians against by Saddam Hussein. There was no question on which side the U.S. and everyone in the Gulf knows which side the U.S. was on in that war, and the Arab states were afraid of an Iranian takeover in the Gulf, and they were all backing Saddam at that time. He then made the fatal mistake of invading Kuwait after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and that was when relations soured, to put it mildly. Another point about Iraq was, remember that the Israelis bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak long before the war. And it didn't stop Saddam. It stopped his nuclear program, but it didn't stop his aggression. It didn't stop his mistreatment of his own people. It didn't stop his threat to Iran. It didn't stop his invasion of Kuwait. So just bombing a nuclear reactor does not necessarily stop aggression.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glass, for following up on this, and very, very, very much insightful comments, Ambassador Jeffrey. Of course, because as we know from many perspectives, of course, there is much argument on how far constructive or not constructive, of course, the role of the U.S. has been in the Middle East and the Arab world, of course, in general. And with this in mind, I want to take back this point to you, Ambassador Jeffrey. Do you think, with what many people refer to as American soft power diminishing in the region, we may agree or disagree, but in your opinion, does this open the door for new actors to come in, thinking about Turkey, for example, China, and even Russia, of course, to fulfill a diplomatic vacuum? And in your opinion, what are the consequences for multilateralism and for the future UN-centered diplomacy in the Middle East if that happens?
Well, this could all change tomorrow if Trump makes the wrong decision, goes into a war that he is not willing to fully carry out, or does badly, or he somehow backs off and allows Iran to move forward on the last stages of enrichment. And by the way, the arguments about nuclear contamination are very correct, but they're being used incorrectly. The point is, you can't say, well, Iran is only a few weeks away from developing at least a crude nuclear device with this level of fissile material right now, but it's not time yet to take military action because they're not there yet. Maybe they won't be. The problem is once they get to that point, and we saw this with the Al-Kabar reactor in Syria in 2007, once they get to that point, then you really can't bomb them. You really don't have a military option because you really will contaminate vast areas like in Chernobyl back 30 years ago. And at this point, nobody, including the Iranians, thinks that Israeli bombing, including at Bushehr, has done that. But it's something that once you get beyond a certain point, and we have dealt with this for real with Syria, and we're now dealing with it with Iran. Now, getting to soft power, I'm not a believer in soft power. I never was. I had to genuflect at that altar because much of the American foreign policy community loves soft power. It doesn't like hard power. The United States position in the region is stronger today than it has been in many years because the United States-backed coalition has dealt a major set of defeats, first to Al-Qaeda, then to the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and now to Iran. The issue to the United States is how much longer are we going to commit our hard power to the region? Because we have 40,000 troops still there. And at the moment, we have 3 aircraft carriers, which is probably all the aircraft carriers we have underway anywhere in the world outside of the United States in the Middle East. We have more pressing security concerns in East Asia. So the issue is, can we find some kind of resolution of this? The idea of China or Russia playing, or the Europeans playing any role in any of this stuff, folks, listen to the news. Rightly or wrongly, it's the Arab states, it's Israel, it is Turkey, and it is Israel, the Arab states, Turkey, and the United States that are calling the shots in the region, working among themselves, usually together, sometimes at cross purposes, to try to secure the region. The Chinese and the Russians have nothing to say. They have nothing to offer. In the case of China, they buy a lot of oil and some gas from Iran and the region. They have commercial interests, but they're not a diplomatic player of any consequence when the chips are down. Right now, the chips are down. That's simply the reality. I'm not so sure it's a good reality. Many Americans aren't too happy with this. But the point is, we're also not too happy when we get a 9/11. We're also not too happy when we get an oil embargo, as in 1974. We're not too happy when countries like Kuwait are gobbled up by an aggressive state. So we're not too happy, most Americans, with what happened on October 7th, 2023. So we're still stuck in this region, and we're trying to work our way through it as best we can.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jeffrey. Let me think aloud with you, Sheikh Nawaf, of the worst case scenario. The GCC economies, while diversified, still depend heavily on regional stability for foreign direct investment, tourism, and logistics. So, are the Gulf states prepared for the financial strain of a long term war in case this conflict continued or expanded? And more strategically, could this crisis push them to invest more seriously in, for example, joint economic security infrastructure, such as energy corridors bypassing conflict zones? How do you think they will play this out?
Well, right now, as things stand, I think that the GCC have a robust economic structure that can weather the current situation. However, if this develops and devolves as it evolves into something much more dangerous and much more chaotic, then we are at this unknown. It's very difficult to predict. Now, what is not difficult to predict is the question of would the Gulf, for instance, water be contaminated if Bushehr is struck? This is not theoretic. This is science. We can't just kind of just wave a magic wand and says, well, contamination, that's just a word. It doesn't happen. No, it does. The head of the IAEA said that is, if it gets struck, then that is a very strong possibility. Now, the Israelis could easily say, we're not going to strike it. They haven't said that. The U.S. could put assurances. The U.S. hasn't said that either. This ambiguity for the sake of ambiguity, not strategic ambiguity, is not reassuring the Gulf, and it doesn't reassure investors and the global economic health, because that would have an effect on the global economy as well. So this is not theoretical pie in the sky. I've been in kinetic operations. I've been in active war zones. It is easy to say, well, just fight a war and a couple of bombs here, a couple of bombs there. Who's counting? We'll get this over done in a weekend. I've served for almost 3 decades, and I know, and I've been in several active operations. This is very easy to say when you haven't seen this thing, firsthand. It is extremely difficult. It is almost in my lifetime, I haven't seen any wars in the region end in complete victory by military means alone. And I don't see how this happens in this case. And, somehow we were supposed to think that this is an outlier. But more importantly, looking at, taking, a 30,000, feet view of this idea of forever wars. The people of the Gulf are not interested in forever wars. I can speak for Qatar itself, when you talk about, well, Qatar will need, the US to secure. The fact remains Qatar has never asked the US for, security guarantees or defense pacts. It's never happened. We view that diplomacy, de-escalatory diplomacy, is the real means to end any conflict. And this is not any different. But I would it's very difficult for me to believe that anyone in the US would be encouraged into going to another war in the Middle East. Not only us in the Middle East don't want it, I don't think many in the West, whether in the US or Europe or anywhere else, to be frank, would want, another endless war. Because if the starting point is let's start bombing and we'll see where it goes from there, well, then I'll stop you, because that's not how operations should be conducted. And unless there's an end state, which hasn't, it's not clear to me that there's been a clear enunciation of an end state through military means, then unfortunately this, goes down this dark path of death and destruction. And it is not theoretic, and it is not pie in the sky. It is actual, it is real, and it is unfortunately very close to happening if the US leads with the GCC countries in finding a way out. But in the end, we need both the Israelis and the Iranians to cooperate. And I think there is a window, but that window is closing very soon. And if that happens, as you said, economically, it will have reverberations beyond the GCC.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nawaf. And obviously, nobody wants an endless war. But if I continue thinking aloud of this worst case scenario, let's say, I want to ask Dr. Lawrence in this sense, talking about the US. With these continued attacks on infrastructure, energy hubs, and trade corridors, the economic impact of this war is quickly and definitely going to extend beyond the combatants. Washington now, to many critics, is facing dual risks: a possible oil shock and increased pressure to maintain freedom of navigation. So, in your opinion, what role does economic disruption play in shaping U.S. policy going forward? Is economic stability becoming as urgent a priority as military deterrence in Washington's strategic calculus? You're muted, Bill. Please unmute.
Not enough. If you follow the business community, they're up in arms, but not the wider foreign policy establishment, not the Trump administration. But we do know that Trump understands two things really well. He knows war is bad for business, and he knows that he's against forever wars, as is most of his base and the Democrats as well. So the Trump administration can build off of those two things, in my opinion, to move in the right direction. And I think we are right to question forever wars, although that it's interesting to repose that question in the context of the list that Ambassador Jeffrey produced on the terrorist threats, because in some sense, the war on terror is a forever war. But if I could also talk about this other concept we've been hearing a lot about, which is perpetual war. What my main view of what's going on here is that Israel is involved in a perpetual war on many fronts that causes more problems long-term than it solves short-term. And that question of forever wars, perpetual wars is really important, because a sustainable peace for Israel is going to have huge reverberations out. And a lack of sustainable peace for Israel is going to make all of these other problems worse, including what's going on in Iran now, what's going on in the Red Sea, what's going on in the corridors and in the economic aspects. And COVID plus Gaza, taught us a lesson that everybody is affected down to the last toothbrush they buy by what's going on. But again, we don't see enough public outrage or public outcry yet about inflation or supply chain disruptions and all that stuff. But that's coming if this gets worse. And contamination could make it. I mean, there are a lot of things that could add on to this. So, I'll go back to, I think, what Brzezinski said some decades ago in his famous speech at NEI. In the Middle East, it always comes back to Israel-Palestine. And until we get past this idea from both political parties in the U.S. That normalization with Israel is going to solve anything without a pathway to peace for Palestinians and a state, we're imagining positive outcomes that won't happen. I mean, when Trump said wonderfully, we need this ceasefire in Gaza, and forced it through, and then said the Palestinians need to leave, that was another case of not understanding the essential issue. The Arab League, the Islamic Organization of Islamic States, they're built around Palestinian identity. They're built around the Palestinians staying and thriving. Something that Trump also understands when he starts talking about Palestinians thriving. So there's plenty to build on here, in terms of the administration's values. But the better angels of the White House, both economically and politically, are going to have to come out, and these other demons, are going to have to take a step back if we're going to see the type of economic and political outcomes that everyone on the panel desires.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence. I want to stay with this thought and still with an eye on the economy. And I want to take it to Mr. Glass. There is no doubt that this war exacerbates structural economic crises already present in many Arab countries, of course, Iraq, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon also. From food inflation to energy insecurity, public frustration is obviously rising. Based on your reporting experience, do you foresee a new round of region-wide protest movements similar to 2011 or even 2019 emerging from this conflict-induced economic pressure?
I'm not really a prophet, so I don't know what's going to happen. But 2011 was a very specific thing where the Arab publics wanted to overthrow their regimes, none of which were elected, none of which were chosen by them, none of which were seen to be just to their people. They were trying to overthrow those regimes. Those regimes now seem to be secure. And in Egypt, for example, they're not going to be overthrown this time. And the public is being kept down. I don't see why those protesters from that time would now come out and make protests for Iran. They had some protests over Gaza because of the annihilation of so many innocent people in Gaza. But I don't know that they would do the same for the Iranians, who are another people who speak another language and with whom they don't identify wholeheartedly. So my guess would be no, but tomorrow I could be proved completely wrong, and they'll all be out in the streets demanding that the attack on Iran be stopped.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glass. I would like to, before I take the questions from the audience, to end with a round of questions more looking forward, hopefully away from my thinking of the worst case scenario. Hopefully we will see some diplomatic efforts fructify in the very coming short time. So feel free, please, to answer the question and expand the way you feel relevant to thinking forward about how this conflict between Israel and Iran could be curtailed. Given all what we discussed, Ambassador Jeffrey, what actionable steps can the U.S. government take other than halting Israeli operations to contain this conflict and prevent a wider escalation? Is a renewed sanctions regime on Iran enough, or is the current environment too kinetic or for economic tools to matter?
First, I dispute the argument that what we have is an Israeli-Iranian conflict. What we've had in a critical phase since 2023, and in a larger sense, as I keep on emphasizing, but I get little response, since about 25 years, is a Iranian aggressive march through the region that various states at various times have opposed in various ways, from the Arab states to Turkey to Israel and the United States. It's at a critical point now because Iran is fighting its last battle for its last remaining, if you will, chips, its nuclear program. There will be some kind of diminution of Iran's nuclear program following the end of this conflict. This conflict will not go on as an endless war. I've been involved in most of America's endless wars. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops in decades, be it Vietnam, be it Afghanistan, be it Iraq. That's not on the table in any way, shape, or form. There can be other destructive conflicts. There can be other military problems for us and for others, but it's not going to be a endless war. Trump will not go into that. The American people won't support it, and there's no need to do it because endless wars were focused on changing hearts and minds of a population, and we're not in that business anymore. We are in the business of stripping Iran from its nuclear weapons capability. That will happen within the next month, one way or the other, and then the region we'll see at least initial peace and the chance to put things back together again. I think the U.S. And the Arab states will be playing the key role in that until Israel can resolve the Gaza conflict and make progress on the larger Palestinian issue, which is not the core issue in the Middle East. I'm sorry, but it's not an unimportant one. I think that Israel's role will be far less than the United States and the Arab states in trying to put the pieces back together after this long conflict. Again, its critical phase beginning in October of 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. And let me take also another forward-looking question to Sheikh Nawaf. As we know, Sheikh Nawaf, the GC states warned against such a war, even when President Trump visited the region in last May. There is no doubt that the Gulf states also have their own red lines. So if the U.S. intervenes directly, whether in Iranian airspace or in the ground, how would this impact American basing agreements, force posture, and even intelligence sharing with the Gulf states? Would GCC capitals support intervention or quietly resist deeper U.S. entanglement in a war, not of their making, of course?
Well, first of all, actually, I agree with Ambassador Jeffrey that the U.S. May not want to go into another forever war, and I don't think this is the intention of the current administration. So I agree with the ambassador for that, and I thank him. Unfortunately, like everything and like debt, how do you get into debt or how do you go bankrupt? It's the same way you go into war, gradually, then suddenly. You don't intend to. But it's one of those things that I think, at least from a hopeful perspective, I think let's hope it doesn't get to that. So there's that. I think that's positive, that there is no intention, I think, to go to another forever war. However, when it comes to intelligence sharing, I don't think any of the current postures, the military posture, will affect U.S. GCC relationship from a defense perspective, from intelligence sharing. I think that is a very ironclad relationship, long-lasting relationship that will continue. Urging all parties to end this war, and the main parties to this point at least are Israel and Iran, will always, I think, continue to be paramount for the GCC countries as long as this conflict continues. Finding a peaceful way to move forward with the U.S. and led by the U.S., I think, the only way to go forward, as Dr. Lawrence mentioned, the U.S. has the only leverage with Israel. So that, I think, is one way to move forward, is more cooperation with GCC to find a peaceful resolution, to avoid an expanding military kinetic activities. Now, looking at the news, anyone would, logically surmise that it may get worse before it gets better, which is not always a good thing, but it may be a reality of how things would develop. But there is that window of opportunity and hope. I think the Trump administration wisely chose this up to 2-week period for negotiation. And I think the GCC will do a lot to support that, namely Oman and Qatar, but all of the GCC will continue to support finding a hopeful, non-kinetic way forward through de-escalatory diplomacy and negotiations.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nawaf. And with this forward-looking idea still in mind, Mr. Glass, what would a responsible media response look like in this environment, especially when misinformation and polarization are rampant? What lessons from your time covering other regional wars apply here?
Well, first of all, not to believe the lies that come out of Washington, as most of my colleagues did when the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq, and now they're all ashamed of how they behaved. If they go on believing the lies, they'll go on reporting the lies. The duty of journalists now, as always, is to tell the truth and to report fairly and honestly what's happening. And I would hope that that's what they'll do. I suspect they won't, but that's what I would hope they would do. That's their duty to their public, to their readership, to their viewership, who expect when they see them and read their words that they're going to get a straight report. That doesn't, you can't do more than that. You don't have to take sides, but you have to report fairly and honestly what's happening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me take a couple of questions from our audience. Some of these questions are also coming from our summer interns who are following this topic very closely. So I'll take the first question to Ambassador Jeffrey. It's two-part question, actually. So how do you think the current war will impact Israel's internal political dynamics, considering the already existing political turmoil surrounding Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ongoing conflict in Gaza? And part two of that question, Ambassador Jeffrey, is President Pezeshkian was elected in large part on the promise of a nuclear deal with the US. What effect may the lack of a negotiated settlement have on Iranian politics? So obviously this question about internal political dynamics in Israel and Iran.
Sure. It's hard to say. There is a huge split in Israel. We talked earlier about, I don't know who said it, but Israel is pursuing endless war in the region. That's true only in the sense of there are people associated with the current government who have that approach. And that's not the approach of most Israelis. Most Israelis see themselves in a basically defensive mode. Most Israelis would be willing to accept a compromise settlement in Gaza along the lines of the approach that the Emiratis and the Egyptians have proposed that would have a role for the Palestinian Authority. That is something that I've worked a lot on with both the Israeli and with Israeli and other countries' officials. So I think that that issue is still out there. In the short run, any kind of resolution of this conflict that leaves Iran weaker will strengthen Bibi Netanyahu. That means that the more aggressive Israeli approach to regional problems, which we saw until recently, for example, in Syria, might continue, although Netanyahu, at least, and we see this very much with Syria, is able to shift position and take a more accommodating line if they do not feel threatened. I think in Lebanon that will work out okay too. I realize they're still occupying 5 positions, but there's some hope that they'll eventually give them up. In terms of Iran, it's very hard to say. I think the Iranian people, as we've heard earlier, will rally around the Iranian government. On the other hand, they will also ask themselves, why did this happen? And it hasn't been mentioned so far. In fact, if I were to have the takeaway line from this discussion, it's been the Israeli aggressive war against Iran. Wait a second. Aside from all the other things Iran has done to the Israel, the US, and Arab states over the past 20 years, Iran launched 500 missiles at Israel in 2 major attacks in 2024 without any significant provocation. That was an act of total war, and Israel is totally justified in continuing this conflict. That doesn't mean it's wise to do it, and it doesn't mean that the Iranians will not rally around their government. But they also, sooner or later, will ask themselves, why did we get in this mess? And how come our government and our military cannot protect us from the Israelis who are now all over our airspace? So that's another question we'll have to look at.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jeffrey. The following question I have is about the U.S. internal politics. So I'll take that one to Dr. Lawrence. We have seen growing divisions within the Republican Party over U.S. involvement in the war. Some prominent Republicans have urged President Trump to resist pressure for military engagement, while others are pushing for support of Israel. How do you interpret these rifts, and what do they reveal about the current state within the Republican Party?
They're significant, they're growing, they're very interesting to watch. I remember during the first Trump administration attending rallies down on the Mall where the far left and far right Americans were taking anti-war stances that have percolated forward in a way that I just found really interesting. Another way in which the sort of Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and part of the MAGA right intersect, and a lot of prominent people, I won't go through the entire list, but a lot of prominent people are coming out hard against this war, particularly those that speak to the younger MAGA Republicans, which is a growing part of the base. I would say that the anti-Iran hawks around Trump are preeminent. I think it's very significant that Rubio took over the National Security Advisor job in addition to the Secretary of State job, which puts a very robust anti-Iran hawk right in the center of the conversation. And Tulsi Gabbard, who's carrying all that intelligence assessments, for example, about how Iran was not actively developing a weapon for several years now, I think going back before the JCPOA, she's been completely sidelined from the conversations, even as DNI. Let me also say that I strongly agree with what the ambassador said about forever wars and about domestic Iranian situation. But I would say that the killing of Iranian leaders, previously by the U.S. in Iraq and then in Syria, and the attacking of Iranian diplomatic facility, even if it was a dual-use facility for war, and several other things, had a very strong antagonizing effect on Iran. I don't think it was nothing. I would also say one other thing I think we should throw out, since we're getting towards the end of the conversation here, which is that people often forget the Europeans never left the JCPOA. And even though Iran was flagrantly violating the JCPOA, there are aspects of it that are still in place and could be reactivated quite quickly. So even if the Europeans don't have much leverage vis-a-vis Israel as much as the US does, the Europeans do have leverage vis-a-vis Iran, and they'd also like to lean in on the economic engagement with Iran, and have been largely blocked by the United States. So there's an interesting sort of confluence there between the business interests behind Trump, who want to open Iran, and the European interests that want to open towards Iran. I mean, all that will come into play once we get back to a negotiating phase, which I think we all hope will be sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence. I will take one last question. This one is about related to the GCC, so I will take it to Sheikh Nawaf. Maybe you have partly addressed this one, Sheikh Nawaf, but I will leave the comment or final thoughts to you. So how have the reactions from the GCC countries varied in response to the conflict? And how do their differing economic and strategic interests in both Israel and Iran shape their responses?
Well, if we see the responses that have been public, there is no difference. Well, at least until this point, they've been unified in their response. They've been clear that the GCC countries have been coordinating issues of contingency plans vis-a-vis economic disruption, contingency plans vis-a-vis ecological or environmental questions, or contamination of the Gulf, or probable issues of that nature. So right now, as it stands today, on the 8th, I believe, of the war, or the attacks on Iran, the GCC is lockstep clear, whether the GCC, the organization, or individual states. Now, could that change in the future? That is a possibility. I personally don't see that happening, because the interests align. The same threats across the board is of concern to all 6 nations. The same economic interests, access to the Gulf, freedom of navigation, and the environmental concerns are equally shared and a concern amongst all 6 nations. It is a small area in the Gulf that all these countries look over, so it's not difficult to imagine why there would be there will be consistency in that nature. So as it stands today, I think Gulf countries are very clear. They've condemned the Israeli attack on Iran. Whether you like it or not, that's a different issue. I mean, people may have different views, and that we should respect them. But the facts remain. They've came out. very strongly against that. They've been very strongly for de-escalation and negotiation, and very strongly, kind of concern about the health and well-being of the Gulf, whether in a geographic sense or in an economic sense as well.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Nawaf, and thank you very much, our esteemed guests. So, as we close this very important discussion, one thing is clear. The Israel-Iran conflict has ushered in a new and dangerous chapter for the region, one that demands sober reflection, strategic clarity, and renewed diplomatic will. The collapse of negotiations and rise in direct confrontation have tested the limits of traditional alliances, shaken regional stability, and exposed the urgent need for new mechanisms of dialogue and de-escalation. Moving forward, the challenge before us and these challenges before us are not only to manage the current crisis, but to lay the groundwork for a more resilient and inclusive regional order, one built on cooperation, not confrontation. Thank you very much for being part of this critical conversation. And with this being said, I turn it back to you, Del. You are muted.
Saying what a splendid conversation, and I can't thank you all enough for your contributions. Dr. Hilani, thank you for moderating so well, as always. This has been a very timely discussion, as it seems to be extremely fluid. I would like to thank Ambassador Jeffrey, Your Excellency Sheikh Nawaf, as always, Mr. Glass, Dr. Lawrence, for sharing your expertise. And to everyone who joined us today, we will be having a lot of these, and we hope that you'll stay with us, as we always seem to. We've been blessed to attract the best of the best to lend their input, to lend their experience with respect to our subject matter. And this conversation certainly was a vital step in highlighting both the complexities and the challenges and the opportunities ahead of us. As we look forward to future discussions that further explore situations on this ongoing crisis, we thank you, my friends, and we'll just leave it at see you soon. Until then, be safe, hug your families, and God bless America. Thank you.